From a young age, I always knew I would become a soldier. I was born into an upper caste family with a proud military tradition. My grandfather was wounded at the Somme, and my father served under Montgomery in North Africa. It was always expected that I would follow in their footsteps, becoming an officer and a gentleman, and so it came to pass. As a young lad, I read military-themed comics, such as Victor's and Boy's Zone. The story glorified war, portraying heroic soldiers executing daring raids behind enemy lines. By the time I eventually graduated from Sandhurst and received my first commission, I realized my military career would be nothing like these boyish adventures. The nature of warfare had changed significantly since my father and grandfather's day. The British Empire was in steep decline, and the armed forces found themselves wounded down in numerous low-intensity conflicts across the globe: Malaya, Kenya, Cyprus, and Aden, to name but a few. The military were no longer fighting national armies, and there was no clear front line. Our tactics had to adapt to this new environment. Psychological operation becomes a significant part of our counterinsurgency strategy. Most people will have heard of Hearts and Minds, which is the goal of winning over the local population and denying support to the insurgent. This was partly achieved through acts of kindness, providing better housing and medical care. But this was also a darker side. Fear is a great motivator, and so we use black propaganda, mass coercion, and other subtle tactics which play on the human psyche, exploiting the population's primal fear, inspiring terror to break the enemy's morale and their will to resist. You won't read about this sort of things in the history books, but it did happen, and I was a part of it. We were so committed to defeating our enemies that we sometimes went too far. We opened doors to dark hidden places, doors which should have stayed closed, and what we unleashed into our world was far more dangerous than any terrorist, gunman, or bomber. Northren Ireland was my first deployment after Sandhurst. I got posted there during the summer of 1969, taking command of an infantry platoon on the street of Belfast. I knew very little about the place back then. Shameful, really, as the province was located only a few miles across the Irish Sea. There were serious riots during the summer, with hundreds driven from their homes and entire streets burned to the ground. The Catholics has gotten the worst of it during the violence. Back then, the Protestants controlled the government and police, and hate most of the dissent job. We had some sympathy for the Catholic minority at first, and they saw us as their protectors. Girls went out with soldiers, and housewives made us cup of tea and sandwiches. This was the honeymoon period, but it didn't last. The next tour in Ulster was during 1971. I was being promoted to captain by then, taking a post with the intelligence corps. My second tour was divided between Belfast, Derry, and the new prison camp established at Long Kesh. The environment has changed dramatically. In the 2 years since my last visit, the Catholic population had grown to hate the army, and patrols were attacked with rocks, bottles, and petrol bombs every time they left the barracks. We also faced a dangerous new enemy, the Provisional Irish Republican Army, or IRA. The Provosts, as we became known, were a well-armed, highly motivated, and utterly ruthless terrorist group, committed to violently ending British rule in Northern Ireland. Our soldiers were subject to sniper attack, and the town center were blitzed by terrorist bombs. Meanwhile, Protestant paramilitary retaliated by killing Catholic civilians. Inevitably, the casualty quickly mounted. The government brought in internment without trial that August, arresting hundreds of suspects in a mass military operation. It wasn't a success. Our intelligence was poor, so we picked up a lot of the wrong people and let the main players slip through our fingers. Internment greatly angered the Catholic community, as did Bloody Sunday. The IRA has no shortage of new recruits, and the violence escalated. It was around this time when I first met Stanley Black. Stanley was an enigmatic, larger-than-life character. He didn't wear a uniform and apparently wasn't a soldier. I never found out exactly who worked for. I assume MI5 or MI6, one of the intelligence agency, but was never certain in fact. No one seemed to know which organization employed him, but he enjoyed free reign and access to all the barracks and police stations across Ulster, and the senior officers all listened to him. Stanley was in the late 30s or early 40s, at the time well-groomed, with dark hair and expressive, piercing eye. He was frequently intelligent, an expert in counterinsurgency, tactics, and master of just about any task he set his mind to. I respect the man, but also fear him. I saw darkness in Stanley Black, a fanaticism and total single-mindedness. There was nothing he wouldn't do and few lines he would not cross to achieve his goal. I regularly meet with Stanley back in '72, drinking with him into the early hours at Teppo's barracks. These were the worst times for the army in Ulster. With 100 soldiers killed that year alone, we were making some inroads against the IRA, but not quickly enough. I felt angry and frustrated, and was prepared to listen to whatever Stanley had to say. He spoke of bringing the war to the enemy, of terrorizing the terrorists. I know he ran a number of operations at that time: surveillance, informers, undercover unit, and pseudo gangs. There were also rumors of more unorthodox and bizarre tactics. The intelligence service had long had a fanaticism with the occur, with primal fear and the powers of mythology. Stanley had been in Kenya and used the Mau Mau tribunal superstition against them. He wanted to do the same in Ireland, explaining the rationale to me one night after a heavy drinking session in the office mess. You're dealing with a Roman Catholic mentally, what a virgin birth, miracle, but also evil of demon that walk the earth. He wanted the population to fear the unknown, to believe that the political violence on the street and backfield would unleash something truly evil and beyond human understanding. The operation started out small, with pentagrams scrawled on bus shelter and rumors of satanic ritual dropped to the local press. After a while, the action took on a more sinister tone, with skin cat dumped outside churches and graveyards desecrated with goat blood. But according to Stanley, this was only the beginning. Back then, I had no idea of what he had planned, and frankly, I did not want to know. In any event, my second tour ended in late '72. I returned to England and tried to forget about Ulster and its troubles, but the violence didn't end, and I got sent back in 1974. On my third tour, I operated along the border, South Armagh, otherwise known as Bandit Country. This was a PIRA stronghold and, at the time, the most dangerous posting in the world for a British soldier. The IRA declared a short-lived ceasefire as they negotiated with the government, but the bloodshed continued, as did sectarian tit-for-tat killing. I worked with the infamous Captain Robert Narak around this time. This was a couple of years before Narak got kidnapped, tortured, and murdered along the border. His body fed into the meat grinder. The violence was relentless, and I became disillusioned and disappointed. There seemed to be no way out, no path to victory or peace. I drank heavily and became reckless about my personal security. The way I was going, it would only be a matter of time before I end up dead. But when I was at my lowest ebb, with almost my last shred of hope gone, Stanley Black came back into my life. I hadn't seen Stanley for over 2 years at this point and didn't know what he'd been doing at that time. I asked around, of course, making distract inquiry among my colleagues. In the intelligence community, almost everyone had heard of the infamous Stanley Black, and most had met him on at least one occasion. However, few would admit to having worked with him, and no one seemed to know what Stanley was up to now. There were rumors, of course, those whispered in the mess hall of barracks, as Stanley had achieved a near-legendary status among the security force, with stories of pseudo gangs, extraditional execution, and illegal cross-border raid. And then there were other stories, darker. One, the occur, black magic, and the paranormal. I didn't really believe it. I suspected Stanley had created these myths himself, probably as part of a bigger plan. His call came entirely out of the blue. I just finished a long shift out in the field and had returned to the heavily fortified barracks at Bracebrook Mill, preparing to drink myself into a stupor to forget. I was surprised to hear his voice over the telephone. Stanley sounded different somehow, his voice deeper and rasper. Our conversation was brief, but nevertheless unsettling. Stanley seemed disconnected from the word he spoke, as if we were reading out instruction on a manual. Stanley said he was now based in Derry City, operating out of Abingdon Barrack. He claimed to be working on something big, an operation with the potential to transform the entire conflict. I can't go into the detail over the phone, he explained, but I need you up here. I need people I can trust, men like you with an open mind and prepared to do whatever it takes to achieve victory. Stanley wanted to recruit me for his classified operation and promised he would take care of all the red tapes with my commanding officers. It wasn't an order, and so I had the right to refuse, but I accepted his offer to graduate that to its probably sound crazy. After all, who would sign up for a mystery operation run by a man with a few, if any, moral sculpture and a very flexible view of the law? But at the time, I was on a downward spiral with few prospecting. I imagined I would either bring myself into an early grave or be killed by a terrorist bomb or bullet along the border. I had no idea what Stanley he planned and doubted his operation would hasten the end of the conflict. Nevertheless, I feel it could restore some purpose to my otherwise pointless existence, and so I accepted Stanley Black's offer. It turned out to be the worst decision of my life. The transfer was quickly arranged, and 5 days later I drove up to Jerry, an unmarked civilian car. I didn't wear a uniform, but did carry my military ID card, which allowed me quick access through security force roadblocks. Jerry, or London Jerry, as it is still known to its Protestant inhabitants, was a bleak and dangerous place back then. A small, mainly Catholic city with high unemployment and a disputed history. The town center had been blitzed by IRA bombs, and the housing estate were a daily battleground between the armies and young Catholic rioters. My instructions were to report to Ebrington Barracks, the main British military base in the city, located on the east bank of the River Foy. I spent some time in Ebrington during my previous tour, and the base hadn't changed much. In the 2 years since originally a Victorian-era barracks, Ebrington had been reactive in 1969 and subsequently expanded, with tall and strong perimeter wall constructed decided to withstand everything from high-velocity bullet, blast bomb, and mortar. I gained access through the security gate and report to the duty officers. To my surprise, the officers informed me that Mr. Black was not present in the barracks, and his base of operation is actually located 5 miles further north, along the short line of Low Foyt. Stanley had, however, organized a motorboat to transport me to his location. I was rather perplexed and irritated to hear this news, as Stanley hadn't mentioned anything about a secondary location during our admittedly brief telephone conversation. Nevertheless, I've come this far and had little choice but to follow instruction. We set off shortly after dusk in a small dinghy. The pilot was a young corporal from Birmingham. He explained how it was safer to travel on the water at night, as there was less risk of sniper attack from the shore. It was a cold and crisp autumn night, with the new moon clearly visible in the otherwise darkly sky above. There was virtually no wind, however, and the looked as still as a dark point. The corporal assured me that the forecast was good, and so there would be no weather troubles on the loft that night. As it turned out, he was dead wrong. I glanced across at the west bank as we went, noting the darkest silhouette of the Cardinal Spire and the old city wall beyond the wall, and out of sight lay the sprawling and improved Bogside area, scenes of the Bloody Sunday massacre in early 72, and now an IRA stronghold. I could hear to the all too familiar sound of conflict carried in the still night air, youth shouting angrily, the heavy clamp of soldier boots, and the harsh crack of the rifle fire. The nightly ritual of violence had begun once again, but nevertheless, our small motorboat sped onward down the river mouth and out into the Lough, which was actually an inlet opening out into the cold water of the North Atlantic. As it transpired, I was misinformed about the location. Stanley's base of operation wasn't next to the Lough, it was on it. Somehow, Mr. Black had commanded a boat, HMS Ramsgate, a former Royal Navy depot ship, which had most recently been used to transport troops into the province. Ramsgate had been embarked for use as a prison ship, but the internests were since moved down to Longcash. The boat was due to be decommissioned until it was acquired by Stanley for one final and very unorthodox mission. I met Stanley on the ship bridge, which I note was kitted out with state-of-the-art equipment including closed circuit television, monitor, speaker, and recording device. There was a small team on board, 2 army technicians called Fraser and Page, and 2 military policemen, Ball and McIntosh, both armed with Browning high-power pistol. Stanley was evidently in command, but his appearance shocked me. Gone was his formerly immaculate tailor suit, replaced by a short, soiled shirt with an open collar. His jawline was covered by a rough stubble, and his hair appeared greasy and unkempt. Stanley also smelled pretty bad, and I suspected he hadn't washed in several days. But what really struck me with his eyes, once filled with a predatory intelligence, but now appearing wide and half-crazed, like those of a man who stared into the abyss for too long and lost his sanity. But in spite of his disheveled appearance, Stanley greeted me as an old friend and implied that done him a massive favor by agreeing to come. HMS Ramsgate had been designed to accommodate several hundred people, but now the old ship was virtually derelict and abandoned. Moored on the loft calm water of a lonely stretch of shoreline, the boat was a rust bucket, but its long and darkened corridor and empty cabin gave off an eerie feeling, one of decay and foreboding. Other than Stanley, myself, and the 4-man team, there was only one other person on board, a young woman with whom I was already acquainted. Aura was a girl in her early 20s, an attractive young woman of slight build, with long flowing dark hair, skin as pale as milk, and deep green eyes. She'd grown up in the Fort District of West Belfast, a working-class Catholic area which had become an Irish stronghold during the early 70s. Aura had the misfortune to have come of age during the early years of the Troubles, and like so many other young people at the time, she'd been drawn into the conflict occurring on the street around her. However, unlike other young women in her community, Aura made the mistake of falling in love with a British soldier. The boy was a 19-year-old private, serving with the light infantry. Try as I might, I cannot recall his name, but he was a handsome young chap, the type with the gift of the gab who knows how to shut up girl. I believe Aura met him at a community disco in Ballymurphy, arranged by the army during the so-called honeymoon period, when relations between the military and local community were still relatively cordial. Aura started seeing the young soldier, but they had to keep their relationship secret as the situation soured, and the locals turned against the army. I don't know exactly what happened between them, but the upshot was that Aura's family and neighbors found out about her illicit love affair, and this caused her no end of trouble. One would have hoped the soldier would do the decent things, but this too end, and he returned to England and prominently broke off his relationship with the young Belfast girl. I believe he had a girlfriend back home. The whole time in any event, a heartbroken Aura was left to face the backlash alone, and even her family, who had pro-IRA sympathy, turned against her. Soon, she was subjected to a brutal and humiliating punishment, being tied to a lamppost and tarred and feathered. This was how the IRA female wing handled so-called corroborators such as Aura, women who went with British soldiers. Once Aura recovered from her injury, she remained ostracized in her community, alone, without friend or family or any prospect. It was around this time that she first came to my attention. Aura got arrested for some minor offense, shoplifting or something like that. She got passed through the system, and my superior officer wanted to use her as an intelligent asset. I was disappointed as Aura handler. The truth was she never provided us with much information, snippet here and there, mostly of little use. But after hearing her story, I took sympathy on the poor girl, setting her up with a flat in the neutral area and keeping her on an active roster, so she continued to receive a small stipend from the government. I lost contact with Aura after they transferred me to the border and was astonished and concerned to discover her involved with Stanley Beck's mysterious operation. I stood on the ship bridge, watching the young woman throw the camera as she sat alone in the cabin below deck. I noted the old-fashioned floral dress she wore, with a leather jacket draped over her shoulder, presumably to keep her warm. Her head was cast downward, and her dark hair covered most of her face. As she smoked a cigarette taking long drags as she pondered her grim situation. I react angrily at first, turning on Stanley and confronting him. What the hell is she doing here? This young woman is no terrorist. You no right to hold her. Stanley shrugged his shoulder dismissively before replying. She was facing 6 months when I found her, luckily and drunk and disorderly. I offered her money and a new start away from Ireland. She came here voluntarily. I felt a twinge of guilt, which lessens my anger clearly. All her life has gone from bad to worse after I left her in Belfast. What do you indeed to do with her? I asked sheepishly. Stanley didn't answer my question, at least not directly. Instead, he took a firm grasp on my arm and forced me to look into his wide, intense eye. I need her. I need you to pursue her, to make sure she does as I say. This will go a lot more smoothly if the girl willingly cooperated. Suddenly, it all became clear. This was why Stanley had brought me up here. He needed me to get to Aura to trick her into compliance so he could conduct whatever twist experiment on her. I didn't know what exactly he had planned at this stage. I suspected it was some sort of new interrogation tactics during interment. We used a 5 technique to break the will of our prisoner. Later, this would be condemned as torture by the European Court of Human Rights. Officially, the British government no longer tortured prisoners, but in reality, our technique had simply grown more sophisticated over the years, with men like Stanley Black pioneering new and unorthodox tactics. I should have refused, but to my internal shame, I agreed to do what he asked. I went down to the cabin, held the frightened girl's hand, and told her everything was going to be fine. That's all that she needed to do was get through tonight, and then she'd be free to start a new life forever, living behind the war-torn street of Northren Ireland. She trusts me, and I fed her a pack of lies. I'll never forgive myself for what I did to Aura, nor should anyone else. I returned to the building control room on the bridge where the tension was building as Stanley's behavior became increasingly erratic. Shortly before the experiment began, he pulled me on one side, whispering in my ears to prevent the MPs and technicians from overhearing. I don't expect you to understand, my old friend. Not at first anyway. I didn't believe it myself. Initially, thought it was all superstitious nonsense, a mean of tricking and frightening thick Irish peasant, but the deeper I dug, the more I saw. I witnessed things which cannot be explained by seeing. There are other realities beyond what we can see and comprehend, an entity which are not alive in the true sense of the word. They did belong in our world, but they want to cross over into our reality. To latch on to the living, their powers are immense, frightening to some, but if we are able to control these entities and bend them to our will, then the possibilities are limitless. I was really left speechless. Was Stanley playing a sick joke on me? Nothing in his demeanor suggests, so the man looks deadly serious. He must have picked up on my discomfort, judging by his next question. You think I'm mad, don't you? I don't blame you, but you will see soon enough. My old friend, you shall witness the power of what comes from beyond. He patted me on the back, smiling faintly before making his way back to the control station and barking orders at his technician. Meanwhile, I just stood there, dumbstruck and in a state of shock. Stanley was right about one thing. I did think he was mad. I believed that the extreme stresses of the job had broken him. Stanley had clearly suffered from some mental breakdown and had come to believe in the paranoid fantasy his unbalanced mind had created. I realized that I should never have come to this place, but now I was here, and I need to take action to shut this crazy operation down. To get Aura to safety and detain Stanley by force if necessary. The 2 military policemen made me able to help if I could get them outside. I was still formulating a plan in my head when Stanley began his experiment, and my last opportunity to stop him was lost. As Stanley gave his order, the technician flicked switch on the control panel, confirming that various electronic functions were operational. Light check, camera check, door lock check. The last announcement worried me the most. They locked Aura in, but why I had no function in this processing and so could only observe with trepidation. I noticed the 2 MPs standing back, watching development closely. look of serious concentration, each on their face, their hand firmly placed on their gun holster, like they were prepared for violence occur at any moment. But my attention was focused on the central monitor, the grainy black and white image of young Aura sitting on the hard chair in her bare cabin, looking increasingly agitated, like she sensed something sinister was beginning. I looked away in shame, instead glancing at the small monitor on either side, which showed the view of various cameras on the ship exterior. I didn't know why they set up cameras looking out to sea, but assumed they were for security purpose. An IRA assault by boat was unlikely, but not unheard of. What I did notice was how the previously calm water were now becoming rather choppy. As the nighttime winds picked up, this struck me as odd. Since the forecast was for good weather throughout the night, I didn't think too much about it, however. With the preparation complete, Stanley lifted a microphone, which I soon discovered was linked to speaker hooked up in Aura cabin, which as they state was more of a prison cell. There was a sense of dreadful foreboding in the control room as we waited for Stanley to speak. I honestly had no idea what to expect. We were all astounded when Stanley began to sing. All these years later, I don't recall the exact word of the ballad. I believe he sang in Gaelic Irish or some ancient variation of that language. How Stanley had learned such a bizarre incarnation, I never know. What I do remember is how the sorrowful ballad shook me to my very soul. The others in the room clearly shared my trepidation. One of the technicians, Fraser I think, let out a nervous laugh before his co-worker, Page, shot him an angry look, and the cool and tough demeanor of the MPs began to crack as fear crept across both face and Macintosh began perspiring heavily. But Stanley appeared immune to everything else occurring as his heart-wrenching song reached a terrifying crescendo. I stared into the main monitor, watching young Aura closely as she listened through the speaker in her cabin. She looked up at the camera in confusion, mouthing something that we could not hear. But before long, her look of bewilderment turned into fear, her eyes widening as she covered in her hairs. I looked away, unable to bear the shame. When I glanced across at the external camera, I was astonished at the height of ferocity of the wave. As clearly a storm had taken hold, seemingly coming out of nowhere. The boat was swaying heavily from side to side. Now, and before long, we all struggled to stand. All except for Stanley, who unexpectedly appeared unaffected, and it became clear to me that there was a connection between the terrible incarnation and the increasingly violent storm. Even though this seemed impossible, as there was something else, something deeper, I felt it inside me, a severe dread unlike anything I'd never experienced before. I knew what it was to fear for my life, but this was different. What I felt in that moment was primal, a terror that I could not explain. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew I had to put an end to it. I need to stop Stanley before it was too late. I stepped forward with determination, heading straight for him, but I struggled to walk. My body is being thrown from side to side as the boat swayed in the heavy sea. I labored on regardless, determined to bring this to an end. Reaching out, my hands were almost upon him, but in that very moment, the light went out and the deck was plunged into darkness. Losing control of my sense, I stunned, hitting the floor heavily. Dear God, I heard someone exclaim. The dark was all-encompassing. It continued for what seemed like an age, but in reality was only a few short seconds. I couldn't see a thing, but my other senses were heightened. I quickly established two things. Firstly, Stanley's terrible ballad had ended, and secondly, the ship was no longer swaying. It made no sense, but this is what happened. A moment passed, and mercifully the emergency lighting kicked in, dimly illuminating the control room. I slowly lifted my head and saw the face of Stanley Black, staring down at me. His dark eyes were emotionless, showing no sign of either fear or concern. He spoke to me in a calm and composed voice, saying, "And now it's begin." The monitor was still out, so we couldn't see Aura inside her cabin cell. I dreaded to think what state she was in. Stanley ordered the two MP to descend to the lower deck and check on her. The two men obeyed their orders, with some evidence recollected. They no longer looked like true and experienced soldiers, but more like scared young boys being sent off to war. Drawing their pistol, Ball and Macintosh left the control room and began their slow descent. Stanley, myself, and the two effectively redundant technicians were left waiting in the dimly lit control room, staring at Black's monitor and still badly shaken by the inexplicable event. We just witnessed Stanley began to speak, rambling at length about destiny and immortality. No longer listening. I felt sick to my stomach, somehow sensing that something terrible was about to occur. It seems like an eternity passed as we wait and suffered through an unbearable tension, and then we heard it, a shrill, high-pitched, and inhumane scream which echoed through the dark, still corridor of the old ship. It was unlike anything I ever heard before, an otherworldly shriek which chilled me to my very bones. A moment later, a man cried out in terror, and then came the gunshot, 3 or 4 loud bangs in quick succession. We listened in terror to the mad scrambling, the shout and gunfire, men running, the heavy boots stomping against the metal gangways, and always the unnatural scream, growing louder and louder, so piercing and chilling. Even Stanley appeared uneasy now, his eyes widening with fear. Evidently, this was part of the plan. His experiment was now out of control. The ominous sound grew closer until the running battle was right on the other side of the control room door. One of the technicians, Fraser I believe, lost his nerve breaking and running toward the back door. His colleague cried after him, and calling Fraser a coward. I didn't blame the man for running, but somehow I knew he wouldn't get far suddenly. There was a heavy banging on the door, and then the handle began to turn. My fear was all-encompassing at this point. I struggled to breathe, and my leg could hardly carry my weight. I was unarmed and had no means of defending myself. Not that I believed a gun could stop. What was coming? The door swung open and a figure ran into the control room, slamming it close behind him. It was Macintosh, one of the MPs. His face was ghostly shade of pale, his uniform ripped and blooded, and his eyes filled with pure terror. He opened his mouth and shouted loudly, as if he had no control over his volume. "She's coming! Run, you fool! She will kill us all!" We didn't get a chance to respond. At that moment, the hellish screaming began. Once again, this time it was so loud it forced us all down to our knees, covering our ears in a near fatal attempt to drown out the awful din. Just then, the still shut door burst open with such power that it knocked Macintosh on his feet. What stood on the far side of the doorway was not of these were, at least no longer. I could just about recognize the physical body of Aura, but whatever creature had overtaken her, clearly it wasn't human. Her skin was paler than the palest white, and yet her body was illuminated by an unnatural light appearing like some kind of walking lantern. Her dress was torn and ripped, with her right breast exposed, but there was nothing sexually attractive about her form. She didn't so much walk as she did glide, as if the natural law of gravity and physics did not apply to her. But what really struck me, what chilled me to my very core, was her or its eyes gone, where the sweet and innocent eye of Aura replaced by something dark, black, and demonic, shark-like and predatory in their nature. I was terrified, but remained glued to the spot, unable to run or avert my gaze from this truly horrifying creature. I saw movement in the corner of my eyes, glancing over and seeing Stanley walking forward toward the beast. His attention entirely focused on this monstrosity he helped create. He seemed transfigured, unaware of anything or anyone else around him. As he was drawn toward the demonic siren, I tried to shout out to get his attention, to warn him of the imminent danger, but far I could not speak. Stanley kept on walking until he stood a mere 2 or 3 feet away from the horrors he brought into creation. I watched him stare into those black, lifeless eyes, and he showed no fear. She opened her mouth, a gaping dark hole which looked like a portal into hell. Suddenly, Stanley awoke from whatever spell had held him in trance, as his face filled with fear, and he surely realized the extreme danger he was in. But it was already too late. The entity screamed once again, except this time it was worse than ever. The The high-pitched din was unbearable. There was no end to it, no relief. I saw Stanley crawling along the ground, blood pouring from his ear as he cried out in agony, but his screams were entirely drained out. I rolled up into a ball, burying my head between my legs, but I couldn't block out the hellish noise. I felt the pressure building inside my head. An explosion occurred inside my brain, and then I felt myself drifting away before the darkness took me. I awoke 3 days later inside the military wing of Musgrave Park Hospital in Belfast. Frankly, I was astonished to still be alive. I suffered 2 profound eardrum and head trauma, but was otherwise okay. Physically, at least, 4 other survivors had been recovered from the Ramsgate, all with similar injuries, but still alive. Stanley Black wasn't so lucky. Officially, his cause of death was recorded as heart failure. The fact that he's been a healthy man in his early 40s, with no previous history of heart disease, was not commented upon. While I was recuperated in hospital, I was visited by several senior government officials, and was debriefed in depth as to repeat time and again my account of the event of that fateful night. I was told in no uncertain terms that I must never reveal what had happened on board the HMS Ramsgate. There was talk of the official secret act of a lengthy prison sentence if I spilled the beans. In truth told, I had no intention of telling my story at that time. Who would have believed me anyway? I imagine the other survivors received similar treatment and were subject to the same threat. Meanwhile, Stanley Black's body was spirited away and buried in secret. And what about Aura, you might ask? Her body was never recovered. Officially, she never been on board the Ramsgate, and so the Ministry of Defense had no record of her disappearing. The entire incident was written off as a communication operation which had gone wrong to an equipment malfunction caused by the storm. The ship was decommissioned after the incident. The old boat was towed to Liverpool, where it was secured to be broken up for scrap. I recall reading a newspaper article a couple of months later, stating how ship workers had refused to work on the Ramsgate after claiming to hear ghostly voice emanating from the ship wall and corridor. The incident was widely ridiculed as a hoax or an excuse for the local union to call strike action. But given all I've seen and heard, I wasn't so sure. They allowed me to return to active duty after my recovery, but I got a new posting in England and never did to return to Ireland. Nevertheless, I found it impossible to forget what happened that night. Image of the demonic entity haunted my dream, as did a terrible wail of death, which I simply couldn't get out of my head. And then, over the next 12 months, the oddest thing happened. All 4 of my fellow survivors from the Ramsgate died, all in separate incident and location. The 2 MPs were returned to frontline duty with their regiment. McIntosh was shot in the head by a sniper, which lays on a patrol in West Belfast, and Ball was blown up by a booby-trapped bomb in South Armagh. Later, Ball, one of the technicians, got electrocuted after an equipment failure in Aldershot Barracks, and Fraser died in a car crash in West Germany. A conspiracy theorist might have assumed that a shadowy government agency was eliminating witnesses to the botched operation on the Ramsgate, but I didn't believe this. In a month after the incident, I read up on Irish mythology and learned of the Banshee, an infamous supernatural entity in Irish legend, whose scream was believed to be an omen of death. The physical description matched what I saw that night, and I became certain that Stanley had assumed such an entity from the other side, using Aura as a vessel to capture this wicked spirit. I realized that all the men on board the Ramsgate had been marked for death, and my own turn would surely follow, but evidently I did not die. The Banshee didn't come from me, and I have lived into an old age. Why did this happen? I'll probably never know for sure. I used to believe I had been spared, that Aura or whatever she turned into still had some residual memory from her former life and remembered the kindness I had once shown her. Now, all these years later, I realized I was only half right, was spared, but only because a quick death would have been too merciful. My life has been one of misery, failure, and pain. I suffered a psychological breakdown a couple of years after the incident and was dishonorably discharged from the military. I never had done a sole job again. Was briefly married, but soon disappointed my young wife, who left me for another man. I couldn't really blame her. There was a child, a son, who I was no kind of father who. We became estranged, and I haven't seen him in 20 years. Eventually, I became addicted to alcohol and prescription drugs, and my health deteriorated. I fought cancer on 3 different occasions, and now I'm an old man at dead dog, slowly rotting away, alone in a miserable nursing home. I realize now that Aura did this to me. She wanted me to suffer because I betrayed her. This awful life has been my punishment. But it's nearly over now. I can feel the cold hand of death creeping ever closer. When I sleep, I see her in my dream, and I can hear the banshees roar at night, growing ever louder. So why have I decided to tell my story now, after all these years? You may think this is meant as an expose of the British dirty war in Ireland, or warning to order to ensure they don't interfere with force beyond our comprehension. In fact, neither is true. This is a confession. The war in Ireland is officially over. The victim had 2 less and different largely settled, but for poor Aura, it will never end because of what I did to her. Aura will never be free, never have peace. I cannot excuse what I did to that poor girl, and I can never take it back. I can hear her now, the banshee sorrowful ballads ringing through the wall of my room. She's coming for me, coming to set me free. I'm so sorry, Aura, and if there is a God, may He have mercy on my sinful soul.